I'm going to be taking a look at trade and the production possibilities frontier, which helps explain how trade works in a more conceptual manner. The thing about the production possibilities frontier is that it's pretty ethereal in a sense. Like, it's not necessarily anything certain. It's not anything that looks like our supply and demand curves from previously. What it is it is going to be a graph, right? It's going to have two factors, just like the previous graphs. However, the graphs are not going to be quantity and price. Okay, what we're going to see instead is that we're going to have a situation where the curve is the two axes are two different types of goods. Okay. So I'm going to use a different example than what the resource likes to use. As you can see here again, right? Usually it's quantity and price, but that's not going to be the case in this time. We're going to use two different examples from the resource. One of those is going to be a replacement for military goods or government goods. One of those is going to be a replacement for consumer goods, right? So the government good we're going to talk about is guns, right? That's the typical kind of replacement for government goods in general. And butter is the consumer good, right? So consumers depend upon butter, right? Whereas, the government depends on guns, right? So here I'm going to create a linear curve, very straightforward. And this is for the United States, right? The country of the United States. And let's say that they can produce either 36 guns or 36 butter, or anywhere in between. Okay, so anywhere along this curve, they can produce goods, whether it is 35 guns in one butter, or 35 butter in one gun, right? These are able to be produced pretty easily. Okay, we're going to actually denote these in the millions of units just to kind of provide this example, right? Again, kind of showed you here that you could produce at the maximums or you can produce anywhere in between. This is kind of almost a spectrum of choices rather than a linear curve where you say you are producing here and that's it. And like we kind of saw with equilibrium and stuff, right? Okay, so there are three states that you can be in on this curve. You could be on the curve, right? And to be on the curve is to be the most efficient possible, right? This means that you are utilizing all of your economy's resources to its maximum, right? You are successfully working your economy to the highest level it can be, right? Anything on that line is the most efficient, right? Anywhere from 36 and 0 to 0 and 36, right? Now, if we look inside the curve, right, let's say that we're at 18 million units of guns and 10 million units of butter. We can produce that. However, it is very inefficient, right? We're seeing a very inefficient economy at that point, right? And then if we go outside the curve, that is impossible, right? You cannot produce outside the curve at this point. At some point, you might be able to get to that, but at this current state, this economy cannot produce there. It is literally impossible to do, right? Unless you maybe add something in that we're going to talk about here in a little bit, right? So inefficient again is not desirable. You definitely want to be on the PPF curve, right? That is without a doubt, right? And so, what happens when we add in a second country into this example? Let's not do it there. There you go. Okay, let's add our neighbor to the north. Let's add our neighbor Canada. Okay, and let's say they can produce at a maximum of 24 million guns and 8 million units of butter. Okay, so again, there's PPF is the same, right? That PPF shows that they can only produce in between there and no more than that, right? And so here we're going to introduce the concept of absolute advantage, right? And so absolute advantage is a situation where a country can produce more of a good than another country. Just period, right? So, for example, in this particular setup, in this model, the United States has an absolute advantage in producing guns over Canada, and it has an absolute advantage in producing butter over Canada, right? So that means that based on absolute advantage alone, the United States should not engage in any exchange with Canada, right? That would not be to their advantage because they have the advantage in these two goods. All right, so the U.S. would never trade in this particular case, right? All right, so let's create. Let's look at what happens if both of these economies don't trade and they decide to make half of each of what they can, right? So for the United States, right, they would make 18 units of guns and 18 units of butter, right? In their midpoint. The midpoint for Canada, right, is a little bit harder to measure, right? But you're going to see that they're going to produce 12 guns and 4 units of butter, right? That'll be their midpoint for them, right? Which, if you're thinking ahead at home, right, that means they can produce 3 guns for every 4 units of butter. Add those up, you're going to get 30 and 22. Okay, so 30 units of guns and 22 units of butter for the total production that these economies together can make. Right, so, that might be okay. That might be fine. But it is at this point we need to maybe think about adding in another concept here, right? And that concept is going to be known as comparative advantage, right? Comparative advantage is very much related to absolute advantage. Okay, so comparative advantage states that, when one country has a lower opportunity cost to produce a good than another country, right? Now, we haven't talked about this term opportunity cost in a while, but if you recall, opportunity cost is the concept of the next best alternative, right? And so opportunity cost means that, so opportunity cost in this model is very easy because the opportunity cost of producing guns is the foregone butter produced, right? And so the opportunity cost is measured directly in the amount it takes to produce the other good. Excuse me. So when we look at the opportunity cost for the United States between guns and butter, okay, what we see here is that this is pretty simple and straightforward, right? We're going to see a scenario where the United States is going to simply trade butter for guns 1 for 1. Right? So the cost of making a gun is 1 unit of butter. The cost of making a unit of butter is 1 unit of guns. Okay. For Canada, that's a little trickier. Okay. So for every 24 guns, there are 8 units of butter. All right. So what that means is that if we brought this all the way down, right, that means that for every 1 gun, right, it takes 1/3 of a unit of butter to produce that gun. And likewise, for every unit of butter, for every 1 unit of butter, we get 3 units of guns, right? So because of that, the cost of butter is 3 guns. For guns, it is 1/3 of a unit of butter. And so what we want here, this is a cost. So what we want is to produce the things that have the lower cost, which means that the lower cost will be butter for the United States and guns for Canada, which means that Canada will solely produce guns, right? And US will solely produce butter, right? They will both specialize in these particular objects. Okay. So for comparative advantage in this particular model, there will always be a comparative advantage for each country in this model, right? Because since these are the inverse of each other, right, that naturally means that one cost is going to be higher for each country, unless, of course, they have the exact same opportunity cost, and in that case, they still want to trade, right? So when we look at if we specialize here, right, we see that the Canada can produce 24 guns, the United States can produce 36 butter, which, as we can see, is greater than the amount that they could produce together if they did not trade, right? They can only produce 52 units total if they did not trade, but with trade, they're able to add up to 60 units, right, which is a pretty significant increase in goods, right? So, with comparative advantage, right, you do want to always see trade, right? And if there are gains from trade, which in this case there are, right, you will see the countries will specialize in whatever you will see countries specialize. I made an error there. If you can't tell, I'm recording the audio afterwards. I lost the audio. I accidentally recorded 2 videos here, and I deleted the wrong one. And so the other video had the audio on it. So unfortunately, I have to kind of talk over this. But if we see gains from trade available, you're going to see countries specialize, right? And that's probably the major takeaway from this that you need for the production possibilities frontier, right? It's comparative advantage. It's where a country is efficient on the PPF or inefficient, or it's impossible, and then absolute advantage and comparative advantage. Okay, so now let's take a look at this in a full economy scenario, right? Using our curves that we've been using from earlier, right? With the perfectly competitive market. All right, so let's set it up, quantity and price, right? And now that I have this very cool tool, this makes these curves nice and easy to make, and very good looking curves here. All right, so we're going to use the market for gas like we have been. I just think it's easier to kind of keep the same market going. Right, and I try to use my straight line thing here. It just doesn't feel very good, so I decided to just do it by hand as normal. $2.50, our equilibrium price, our equilibrium quantity. 100 units, not 150 units. I'll see that here in a little bit and make the correction. And if you guys recall, consumer surplus and producer surplus are this triangle here. And we're going to talk about this as a closed economy, right? So there is no trade here into this country. So this is United States gas in a closed economy. And what's happening here, again, as you recall, producer surplus, everybody, there are certain firms who below $2.50 would be willing to sell gasoline to people. So since it's at $2.50, they are making a surplus, right? And so the easiest way to do that is just find the area of that triangle right there. Same with consumer surplus. There would be people willing to buy that good for a higher price. And so because of that, what you're going to see here then is that consumer surplus is the entire area of that triangle. Okay. So now let's look at what happens when we open this economy up to world trade. And let's see what happens when the world price of gasoline is higher than the domestic price. So the world price is set at $3. Okay, so that means we're going to find a curve. We're going to find essentially a price floor right here. Right, it's not a price floor per se, but what we're going to see is producers are more than happy to set their domestic price to the world price. Okay, and so we're going to see that price go up to $3. Okay, and what's going to happen here is that we are going to see an increase in total surplus, right? And we're going to see an increase in total surplus by the space of this triangle right here, right? We are adding that to our total surplus, which means we are seeing a full-on increase in surplus, right? By that triangle's amount, which you can use math to figure out. It's not too hard. We are also seeing producer surplus increase by this amount, this kind of, I don't know, trapezoid amount. I don't know what kind of shape that is. To go along with the previous producer surplus, while we're seeing consumer surplus shrink to this little triangle. Okay, so producer surplus has grown, consumer surplus has shrunk, but total surplus as a whole has gone up with this world price at a higher level with trade, right? So what's happening to the rest of those goods that are being sold? We can kind of see here we have this huge block, and this amount is going to be exported to the world market, right? So let's say that about 50 units are being bought within the country. Right, within the United States, 50 units of gas are being bought, and let's say overall, 150 units are being bought worldwide. So what's happening then is that those extra 100 units are being sold internationally, right? And so these countries, these domestic countries, are going to make a lot more surplus, a lot more profit from this higher world price, whereas consumers are greatly hurt by this higher world price. Okay, so let's get a fresh one out. Let's make another one just to kind of show what happens when the price is below, the world price is below the domestic equilibrium. Okay, a little less setup on this one, just because I've kind of already done it. I wonder if I labeled my lines here. I don't think I did. Shame. All right, so we got a consumer and producer surplus. We're setting that up as normal. Okay. Hey, at least I'm labeling that, right? And so let's look at a open economy again, this time with the world price at $2, right? Where it is lower than the domestic price. So what we're going to see here is, again, a kind of a price, almost a price ceiling in a sense. It's not a price ceiling. It's not, but it kind of almost shares a lot of the same attributes as a price ceiling. Right. And again, we're going to see an increase in total surplus by the amount of that triangle. Okay. But this time, what we are seeing is a benefit for a different group, right? So we're seeing a decrease in the producer surplus. Right. We are going to see producer surplus shrink pretty significantly here to this red triangle. Okay. Because what you're seeing is a lot of producers can no longer stay in the market at that price, so they're either going to exit the market or lower their prices. And then with consumer surplus, we are seeing them grow pretty significantly. They're keeping their original triangle, as we see right here, but then they're also increasing by this shape, this rhombus, I don't know, by here, as well as our increased triangle, right? Right, and so we're kind of showing, I'm kind of using that to signify that that area is the increase in total surplus. So here you can see that world trade is significantly improves these economies. And I did not mention it, but you can see here that this is going to be this right here will be the amount imported, right? So they will import all of these goods right here at this price, right? Okay. What we do see because of international trade, we see some people and some interest groups really oppose trade and reject trade and try to get it denied. Right. We've seen that recently with the kind of new NAFTA deal that President Trump has been trying to get through. That you see certain interest groups not happy with it. So when you see a decrease in consumer surplus, which you do see when the world price is greater than the domestic price, right? What you're going to see is that you're going to see kind of consumer interest groups, right? Consumer groups that help kind of protect the rights of consumers try to prevent trade from happening because prices are too high, right? And so consumer interest groups will come to the table here to try to prevent that kind of trade. But what you mostly see is when you see a decrease in producer surplus because world price is lower, you see a loss of jobs because these producers are either outsourcing their jobs or they're simply shutting up their factories, right? And so you see a loss of jobs there. And so especially labor unions will come to the forefront here, but then also companies themselves, right, will greatly oppose world trade at that point, right? And so that's why you see a lot of people clamoring about trade, about how it's negative and stuff like that. So I think that's going to do it for this one. Thank you guys so much. On this next one, we're going to get into kind of the nitty gritty of international, or sorry, not international trade, of what companies do and how they make decisions. But thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.